Let's take a look at Quizlet 2. For number 1, we calculated this one together from 0 to 1 second. Our velocity should have been 2 meters per second. From 1 to 2 seconds, our velocity should have been 0 meters per second. And this makes sense because it's a straight line right here. Okay, there's no slope to it. The slope is 0, which means our velocity is 0. From 2 to 3 seconds, ignore that gap right there. The velocity should have been -4 meters per second. And lastly, from 3 to 4 seconds, our velocity, the slope of the line, we calculated 2 meters per second. So what I want you guys to do is take a look at 2.1. Using the results from Quizlet 2, you're going to graph the velocities on this velocity versus time graph. So I want to point out some things. Anytime that we have a straight line, that means that that straight line, whatever that value represents, that line represents its constant. So for example, here, our velocity is represented by the slope, by the straight line. Our velocity is constant. When we do our velocity versus time graph, what will that look like? So anytime that you have a straight line on a graph, that means that value is constant. So for our position versus time graph, our slope, our line, is velocity. So that means that we have constant velocity. If you are going to do a velocity versus time graph, what does that mean? What will it look like? As you go from 0 to 1 second, throughout that entire time, you have a constant 2 meters per second. What is that going to look like on a velocity versus time graph? From 1 second to 2 seconds, you have a constant 0 meters per second. What will that look like on a velocity versus time graph? From 2 to 3 seconds, this entire time you have a constant -4 meters per second. What will that look like? From 3 seconds to 4 seconds, we have a constant 2 meters per second for our velocity. What will that constant velocity look like on a velocity versus time graph? So here are the answers, and you can again see that from 0 to 1 second, we have a constant velocity. Again, the y-axis is velocity of 2 meters per second for that entire time interval. Then we jump straight down from 1 to 2 meters per second, 1 to 2 seconds. I'm losing my units here. We have our velocity was 0, so we put our velocity a straight constant line at 0. And then from 2 to 3 seconds, we said our velocity was -4, a constant -4. From 3 seconds to 4 seconds, we said we had a constant 2 meters per second for our velocity for that. This is what it should look like. That is your answer.